Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Greg, for that very kind introduction. Your comments about the 24-hour-a-day on-call take me back to my fond memories of Ottawa. I remember the first Christmas after we had been elected. This would be the Christmas of 2006. It had been a very difficult year. The previous Christmas, we'd campaigned right through the Christmas period. The election was called at the end of November for the end of January. So the previous Christmas, we'd all had our plans, holiday plans, wrecked by working through the 62-day election campaign. And so finally, it was an hour. We worked our backsides off through the transition, through the summer to get things under control. Come Christmas, everybody took off for the holidays. And my father and our in-laws came to Ottawa to stay with us for the holidays. And my father-in-law was the only one in the house who was mighty impressed at 1 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day when the phone rings. We'd only gone to bed a short time before, and it was the Prime Minister's switchboard phoning to find the Chief of Staff where he was while everyone else was snug asleep in their beds. Yes, that's me. It was the Prime Minister on the phone. It was, of course, 11 o'clock Christmas Eve in Calgary, where he was. And since all the other staff had gone off to different parts of the world where there was no cell phone service, I was the only one available. He was supposed to phone Kandahar for a Christmas greeting to the troops in Kandahar. Something had gone very badly wrong with the various administrative connections to make the telephone call go through to the other side of the world. We anticipated there were 800 hungry troops waiting to have their turkey meal, and they couldn't eat until the Prime Minister had talked to them, or so the Prime Minister believed. Not obviously knowing soldiers the way some of the rest of us do. Could I go fix the problem? And spent the first hour of Christmas Day 2006 making sure that the PM finally got through to a bunch of soldiers who, it turns out, were probably not that interested in hearing from the Prime Minister because they'd already eaten all of the turkey that had been shipped from Ottawa for the occasion. I thank you, Greg and Mike Atkinson, and to the Johnson Shoyama School for the opportunity to deliver the Tansley lecture. It's a real honor to be associated with Donald Tansley now, a renowned public servant both here in Saskatchewan and in Ottawa. If the longevity of your policy achievements marks the importance of your impact in life, then I think Tansley, by that indicator, ranks as one of the best who has ever plied the trade of public servant in Canada. And I'm pleased to see a school that's named for both Johnson and Shoyama to recognize Tansley's lecture that way. There must be something in the soil or the water here in Saskatchewan that's produced so many fine public policy practitioners and scholars. I was honored to have, I don't think he's here, John Courtney from the University of Saskatchewan on my thesis examining board a few years ago now. And I have lots of other friends in the community here. I was happy to see Bob Hawkins, my former colleague from Western here, and Mike Atkinson I've known for years. I see Janice Stokes is here, and got an email note earlier from Olefin Brodie, who would have been here, but she had engagements elsewhere. Both graduates of the Calgary School, although I don't think I want to out them quite that way in public. And my dear friend Fred Wall, who's here, who works for Farm Credit Corporation. I also won't outline to him in front of all of his friends and colleagues his many connections to the University of Calgary and the Calgary School. The one missing from my great group of Saskatchewan friends here is Wayne Waters, who's busy running the Government of Canada as Clerk of the Privy Council, I know. Wayne continues, I would say, in the superb tradition of Johnson and Shoyama and Tansley. There are times when the work of public policy is in building anew, in the likes of Medicare and old age security and other elements of the social safety net. There are other times when the work of public policy comes in steering through choppy waters, or retrenching and pruning in the public sector. And I can think of no better person to be in charge of those sorts of things than Wayne, as honest, dedicated, and public-spirited a public servant as I've ever met. Let me talk a little bit about politicians, civil servants, and political aides. I've never given a lecture of this sort before, and I find it especially intimidating to do it at a school of public policy because despite having earned, as Greg explained, 3 degrees in political science, and all the years of study involved, I actually never took a course in public policy myself. I have no formal training of any kind. I can't say I deliberately avoided the study of public policy. I guess I should have taken a course or two along the way. The graduates of the program here, as I mentioned earlier, will be immeasurably better equipped than I was to go on to government if that's the direction they decide to take. Really, when I became PMO Chief of Staff, I had no idea what I was doing. But I never took a course on political parties either, and yet I still ended up as Executive Director of the Conservative Party during its formative years. And I like to think we did a pretty good job of building that party. I'm still proud of the work we did there. So I hope my status as a rank amateur in the policy world doesn't hobble my contribution tonight. I had only one real introduction to public policy before I became Prime Minister Harper's Chief of Staff. As I say, I didn't take any courses, but there was a great BBC documentary on public policy from almost 30 years ago that I watched before we were in government. It was a superbly crafted show that ran over several years. It looks at life inside the very top of a little-known branch of the British government called the Department of Administrative Services. Some of you have maybe seen it. It focuses almost entirely on the working relationship between the minister, the Right Honourable Jim Hacker, and his permanent secretary, Sir Humphrey Appleby. Now, when I first saw the show, I thought it was one of these great British comedies, but soon after Prime Minister Harper was sworn in as Prime Minister and I became Chief of Staff, I told a joke about the show in a group of deputy ministers, and the most senior of the group of them called me to task. He was quite upset that I was telling jokes about the show. He said he did not find the show at all funny, and that in Ottawa, everybody knew it was a documentary. And that made me admire the show even more, because those British documentarians must be very droll. Now, if you've seen the show, and I take it from the laugh some of you have, although probably not in the deputy minister way, you'll remember the dynamic at play. Hacker, the minister, is a very well-meaning man. He becomes minister with the dual democratic mandates. First, he was elected to Parliament, of course, by his constituents, and then he was named by the Prime Minister to serve in Cabinet and preside over this department. Along the way, he acquired many fine ideas about what he would like to implement in his department. And as I recall, he was a newspaper editor before he ran for office, and being a newspaper editor is a very good way to get all sorts of fine ideas in your head, I can tell you from personal experience, having met many a newspaper editor. Fine ideas by the bushload full. When it comes to running the department, however, Sir Humphrey always seems to hold the upper hand over his minister. There are several reasons for this. I would list them as follows. First of all, Hacker is new to government, and Sir Humphrey is a veteran civil servant, so he knows his way around government to begin with. Secondly, Hacker doesn't know anything about the department he's supposed to run, whereas Sir Humphrey knows a great deal about the department, and even when he doesn't know something, he controls the flow of information to the minister, what we would call in the academic world an information asymmetry. Thirdly, Sir Humphrey, not the minister, controls the future career paths of the public servants working in the department. So everyone on staff has a very direct interest in pleasing the permanent secretary, not necessarily the minister. Fourthly, and I must admit I picked this up watching the show after I was Chief of Staff, Sir Humphrey is very close to the Cabinet Secretary, the Prime Minister's top civil servant. So he has his own channel to the Prime Minister, and most days that channel works much better than Hacker's does. And finally, of course, there's the fact that Sir Humphrey took a first at Cambridge, whereas poor Hacker finished with a third from the LSE. And it's not just his Latin that suffered as a result of that. Now, the minister does have one assistant to help him do his job, and that's his private secretary, Bernard Woolley. Bernard is wise to the wily ways of Sir Humphrey. He understands the odder habits and traditions of the civil service. And I find in watching the show, he's terribly sympathetic to Hacker's more altruistic efforts on behalf of the British people. Bernard is a considerable asset to his minister. But when push comes to shove, and a true conflict of wills between the minister and his permanent secretary, Bernard is also a civil servant, and Sir Humphrey is quick to remind him that he, Sir Humphrey, prepares Bernard's annual performance evaluation for civil service progression. So while Bernard is a considerable asset to the minister, there are limits to his value. You have to have a certain sympathy for the minister's plight. He's in an almost impossible position. He's dispatched by the Prime Minister to oversee a department he knows nothing about, only to find he is outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and, let's admit it, regularly outsmarted by the loyal civil servants for whom he answers to Parliament. The viewer is left to wonder, and surely this is the lesson the documentarian wished to convey, whether the civil servants are working for the minister, or is it actually the other way around? The series, in my view, never really confronts the fact that Harper, after all, is the one with the democratic mandate. That presumably should matter in a country that calls itself democratic. It's true, if Harper were smarter, he would probably be able to ensure that his democratic mandate won the day more often. So let's hope, along with the British viewers, that the more important departments that administrative services get better ministers than Harper. But in a democracy, the most skilled citizens are not always elected to Parliament, and the best and brightest do not always end up in the government benches. As Sir John A. Macdonald is reported to have said, in response to criticism of his cabinet, "If you want a better cabinet, please send me better wood." You know, I'd heard that before I was Chief of Staff, but boy, did it come back when I was in the Prime Minister's office. In our parliamentary system, the Prime Minister selects his ministers from among those elected to the government caucus, and even the best of these members faces a very difficult job when becoming a Minister of the Crown. Now, I have no doubt that the Department of Administrative Services would have been better administered if left solely to the prerogative of Sir Humphrey and his staff. In fact, the British and Canadian governments alike, most governments, would probably be better administered by career public servants if they were left unburdened by ministers at all. After all, public servants are recruited on something akin to the merit principle. They are trained experts and promoted on merit, or something close to it. There's great appeal to the bureaucratic ideal. Perhaps we'd be better off if we had a system with an elected Prime Minister and nothing but bureaucrats underneath him. But even if all career officials were philosopher kings, government by bureaucrats isn't terribly democratic. And we know that not all bureaucrats are philosopher kings, even the ones with good firsts from Cambridge. The question then I would like to put to you tonight is, do we think perhaps Yes Minister would have looked quite a bit different and quite a bit less alarming for Democrats if Harper had had some good political aides? And I say aides in the plural, it's no use having just one. After all, fans of the show will remember the fate of Harper's one political advisor, Mr. Weasel, or was it Weisel? He got stuck in some terrible office miles from the minister when the minister was sworn in, and eventually ended up with the government agency that supervises all the other government agencies, the sort of British equivalent of the Crown Investment Corporation, I think. Is Ian Harry here tonight? I heard Ian was going to be here tonight. Now, the indictment against political aides. Ministers in the Government of Canada, of course, do have political aides. When I say political aides or political staffers, I'm referring to employees whose salaries and benefits are paid with government resources, but who are not part of the civil service. That is, they're hired and fired by the minister or the Prime Minister and are permitted to be explicitly political. In the federal government, they're called exempt staff in recognition that they are exempt from the provisions of the Public Service Act. They aren't recruited by competitive processes, they have none of the guarantees given to public servants, and they are free from the restrictions on nonpartisanship on the part of public servants. They're not quite the same as parliamentary aides, hired by members of Parliament to staff their offices on Parliament Hill and back home in the constituency. MPs manage an enormous workload from their constituents back home, as well as the regular business of the House of Commons. Parliament gives them a budget to hire 2 or 3 or 4 people, depending on how they cut the money, to help with constituents and parliamentary business. I have never met anyone who begrudges MPs their parliamentary aides. In fact, parliamentary aides, in my experience, are some of the hardest working people in Canada, and every day they help thousands of Canadians with Canada Pension Plan or old age security payments, immigration files, and passport applications. Ministers, by contrast, in addition to their parliamentary staff, have long been able to hire political aides to help with their ministerial cabinet work, and to do that without following the rules governing the public service itself. Thus, these days, in the federal government at least, most ministers are charged with a Department of Public Servants headed by a deputy minister. They are responsible for the work of hundreds, even thousands or tens of thousands of public servants in the department. And they also have a group of political aides headed by a chief of staff that usually numbers less than a dozen. Other than in the Prime Minister's office, a ministerial chief of staff has the pay of an assistant deputy minister or a senior director general. This arrangement was established at the outset of Mr. Mulroney's government, although political aides and political offices existed long before 1984, and the arrangements have been changed several times since then. But the basic arrangement has been constant. The Prime Minister's office, where I worked, is a special case. These days, as when I left PMO, it has about 80 staffers on the payroll. The titles of the senior staff change over time, but the roles hardly ever do. The largest branch of PMO has usually been the tour department, or the operations department it's sometimes called, which handles the onerous and exacting job of moving the Prime Minister around. They deal with the RCMP, the armed forces, foreign governments, and all the people who are invited to the Prime Minister's events. Then there's correspondence, which handles the more political letters and emails that get sent to the Prime Minister. Speechwriting, the press office, the appointments department, and policy. These are all venerable branches of the PMO. They've changed titles over time, but the function remains. Since 2006, when I became Chief of Staff, the Prime Minister's office has also had separate issues management and strategic planning branches to handle the day-to-day nonsense of government and the longer-term, more serious files. What is the justification for ministers having political aides paid out of taxpayers' funds instead of out of party funds? Quite simply, it's because the government has long recognized that ministers require something more than the expert but nonpartisan advice of the public service to meet the demands that we put on them. To make wise policy decisions, ministers need, according to one observer, a combination of sound technical as well as political advice. The Privy Council Office and the Prime Minister provide the following guidance to ministers. A minister's office, according to the guide, says, to provide ministers with advisors and assistants who are not departmental public servants, who share their political commitment, and who can complement the professional, expert, and nonpartisan advice and support of the public service. These offices provide particular expertise or point of view that the public service cannot provide. Not only cannot provide, but should not provide. Thus, political staff are able to draft speeches, press releases, or other documents that conform to the overall political direction of the government. They keep their ministers in touch with the government caucus and opposition critics and outside groups or experts that help serve the government's political agenda. They also provide advice to the minister about pending policy matters or cabinet or parliamentary business that must be managed in accordance with the government's overall political environment. These are all functions that cannot and should not be assigned to nonpartisan public servants. Political aides cannot do partisan work, and so must resign or take a leave of absence from the public payroll when they begin to work on election campaigns or party events. But there is a political dimension to the day-to-day work of government that's rightly absorbed from the public payroll. There are very few systematic studies of political aides in Canada. It seems likely to me that the average age of a political staffer is quite young. When I was Chief of Staff, I would guess that the average age of a Harper government political aide was 30, maybe younger. I would guess that not many have much professional or work experience outside of politics, but I could be wrong. Many, but not all, in my experience, got started working on local political campaigns. Some start as parliamentary aides in the Ottawa office of a backbencher. Others start in the government caucus services office or party headquarters. A number are hired onto ministerial staffs right out of university. That's in my impression, but we don't have any systematic studies of any of this, so I could well be wrong. Since a minister's office is pretty small, though, the presence of just one or two recent graduates inevitably gives the place a very young feel. But I relay this all anecdotally. The rest of the scholarly literature is more of an indictment of the role of a political aide than anything else. The most recent study is Paul Thomas's report for the Olefin Commission. This is the Commission of Inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber business. Thomas was, as I understand it, commissioned to look into how Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office handle the massive volume of mail that's regularly sent to the Prime Minister. The first year we were in office, we had more than 2 million pieces of mail sent to the Prime Minister from Canadians across the country. This issue was germane to the mandate of the Commission. Since this part of the Commission's work reviewed matters which I oversaw as Chief of Staff, I won't comment further on that aspect of Thomas's work, except to say I was never contacted by the Commission, its council, or anyone else connected with the undertaking. However, Thomas went far beyond his assignment to comment on the state of relations between political aides and public servants in the federal government more generally, and his comments were uniformly negative. He writes, for example, about political staffers who are, in his words, relatively junior, do not understand the constitutional foundations of the political system, lack deep knowledge of the machinery of government, and do not have the training or expertise to judge the importance and sensitivity of communications. If that's true, it may also describe most of the ministers we had. He also worries about the expansion of the role of political staffs that might be a sign that governments do not fully trust the willingness or capacity of the bureaucracy to implement new policy directions. The concern about political staff, he writes, is that they are potentially too zealous in their loyalty to the Prime Minister or their minister and too inclined to see governing as a permanent campaign in which protecting the boss is the #1 priority. Politically savvy aides, he writes, have learned that keeping careful records of interactions can be politically hazardous for their bosses. And he writes quite casually about attempts to, his words, manipulate information by political staff to lessen the chances of embarrassing the Prime Minister and covering up problems. There is, he says, in particular, a problem of undue influence of prime ministerial advisors. Undue influence of prime ministerial advisors. His report was not, I submit, balanced or even very systematically executed. It's not clear how he selected the sources he consulted, and there's a distinct shortage of facts or data reported in the report. The Prime Minister's office filed an official response to Thomas's report with the Commission. I was not involved in preparing that response either, but it describes Thomas's report as a heavily flawed document that contains numerous errors and refers to its unsubstantiated claims and lack of authoritative sources. Tom Flanagan, the noted political scientist, my former teacher, and once Mr. Harper's Chief of Staff as opposition leader, also thought the Thomas report needed a more balanced view. The other recent academic study was unfortunately also prepared for a commission of inquiry, which maybe explains why people are so suspicious of political staff. We keep cropping up in things that lead to commissions of inquiry. This study by Leanne Benoit for the Gomery Commission. This study is certainly more balanced than Thomas's and comes to many useful conclusions. Indeed, I was happy to have them to draw upon when we were devising the Harper government's first legislative initiative, the Federal Accountability Act. And yet, even Benoit's study refers to political staffers as statutory orphans and reports of the many footfalls heard echoing through Ottawa's corridors of power. Those that often hit hardest but bear the least scrutiny belong to an elite group of young, ambitious, and politically loyal operatives, the political staff. Benoit continues, this group of ministerial advisors can and often do exert a substantial degree of influence on the development and in some cases administration of public policy in Canada. These powers can and are on occasion open to abuse. Though unelected, uneducated in the theory and operation of the machinery of government, and regularly devoid of professional qualifications related to the ministries with which they are involved, these individuals, by virtue of their political relationship with the party in power and or the minister they serve, are well placed to influence both the bounce and bobble of bureaucratic political interface and the pace and progress of public policy in Canada. Benoit surveys several of the scandals involving political aides from the Chrétien and Mulroney years, and these are serious matters. There is no doubt that some of the episodes unearthed by the Gomery Commission are appalling and inexcusable behavior by political staffers and bureaucrats alike. That's partly why the Harper government passed the Federal Accountability Act to make essentially all political aides subject to the Conflict of Interest Act, to prevent them from going on to lobby the federal government for 5 years after they leave office, and to repeal the right of political aides to bypass the competition of the Public Service Commission and move directly into public service positions. In my view, the most difficult indictment of political aides to answer is the one that political aides are not clearly accountable for their actions and their work. Benoit and others argue that the constitutional status of the political aide is ambiguous. They aren't ministers, who are after all accountable to Parliament, nor are they public servants and governed by the Public Service Act or other pieces of legislation. Benoit then concludes that they operate in a sort of gray zone. Thomas goes farther and argues that political aides are basically unregulated. There is, he writes, no code of conduct to guide their behavior. The Prime Minister's office, in particular, he says, his words, does not fall within the scope of laws, rules, and administrative guidelines that apply to other departments, including the Privy Council office. As the Prime Minister's office response to Thomas's report notes, this is just flat out wrong. Political staff, as I said, are now subject to the Conflict of Interest Act, and this is the result of work I was involved in. Treasury Board also has a set of policies and guidelines for ministers' offices, and PCO has issued guidance to ministers that includes expectations about how political staffers should interact with public servants. And of course, political staff are subject to post-employment restrictions in the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act. I would say the major cause for concern is that political aides, in the course of their normal business, would interfere in matters that are properly the exclusive purview of the public service, hiring decisions and spending issues, or decisions about what information to release under the Access to Information Act. The Gomery Commission confronted several serious questions about political interference in public service hiring and spending connected with the sponsorship scandal. More recently, the Harper government came under fire when a political aide seemed to have instructed officials on what to release and what not to release under the Access to Information Act. And yet these are outstanding examples precisely because there are already clear, powerful, and well-established laws protecting the position of the public service. The Public Service Act and the Financial Administration Act set out pretty clearly the rules governing the hiring and appointment of public servants and the responsibility of deputy ministers for spending decisions. The Access to Information Act is similarly clear. The decisions about what information to release and what information to withhold under the Act are entirely reserved to deputy ministers and whomever they delegate under the Act. And this is for good reason, not to protect principally against political staff. The Public Service Act and the Financial Administration Act were drafted before there were a substantial number of political aides, but to protect the public service and the public good against the trepidations of ministers. There will be times when political aides, of course, inadvertently or on purpose, try to influence decisions that they should leave to public servants. This is not a constitutional or legal gray zone, however. Where deputy ministers have clear legislative authorities, they are well within their rights to step in and, if necessary, take up an issue with the minister. And because deputy ministers are appointed by the Prime Minister on the advice of the Clerk of the Privy Council, if a deputy cannot resolve matters with the minister, he or she must, and I say must, take the matter to the clerk. In my experience, the clerk and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff can and do resolve these sorts of problems pretty quickly. If not, the clerk can raise the matter with the Prime Minister, explaining the legislation involved and the unwillingness of the Prime Minister's minister to resolve the problem. A clerk that cannot protect the long-standing and legitimate position of the public service with the Prime Minister of the day simply must resign. Ultimately, however, ministers are entirely and personally responsible for the conduct of their political staffers. That's the benefit of the lack of legislative direction or framework for governing political staff. This is crystal clear in the Privy Council Office Guideline to Ministers Accountable Government. In fact, it says you are entirely and personally responsible for the conduct of your political staff. I do not think this means a minister must resign every time one of his or her political aides makes a serious mistake. The doctrine of ministerial responsibility, I don't think, in my view anyway, has ever required a minister to resign over anything but the most serious and personal lapse or oversight. But I do note that the personal responsibility of ministers for their aides and the lack of job security for aides go hand in hand. The price of making a serious mistake as a political aide is usually immediate dismissal. And very few political aides, once fired, are later hired back into political staff. I am simply not aware of any public service anywhere that metes out discipline so quickly for similar mistakes. Nor, of course, is making a serious error on the job the only way that political aides can suddenly be unemployed. You lose your job in Ottawa 1 month after your minister stops being a minister. When a minister suddenly resigns or loses an election, or if an entire government is voted out of office, aides get a few months of severance or separation pay and may have great difficulty returning to political work. A senior aide whose minister is suddenly out of cabinet may have to accept a more junior post with another minister to stay in the loop. In fact, this happens all the time. Most political staff I know deeply envy the lifelong security of public service work. Now, it's true that this kind of accountability is pretty rough. It depends entirely on the willingness of ministers and ultimately the Prime Minister to sanction bad behavior that falls short of breaking the law. As we saw in the sponsorship scandal, this kind of rough accountability does not always stop things from getting out of control. But if ministers take a lackadaisical or even overly tolerant approach to accountability for their political aides, the ultimate sanction comes at the ballot box. And in the case of the sponsorship scandal, man, did it come at the ballot box. I was there for it. The accountability of political aides is often quite rough, but the accountability for inattentive governments is much rougher still. Can we improve the situation of political staff and the quality of political staff? Flanagan wrote in his response to the Morning-Schreiber Commission report, "Exempt staff are human beings, and like all human beings, they make mistakes. They work in a human institution which, like all human institutions, is imperfect." And of course, Flanagan is right. In this way, political aides are like public servants, are like university professors, are like everybody else. You cannot impugn the work of political staff by saying they sometimes make mistakes or overreach. That would be criticizing political staff for being human. But it's also true that humans can improve their skills and knowledge with appropriate training, and any organization can improve its ethical performance with careful attention. Ministers' offices are a high-pressure environment, and as I have noted, there are not that many political aides in Ottawa. They're under pressure to keep costs down, and so it's hard to set aside the time or resources for training or supervision. Carleton University recently launched a graduate degree program in political management by establishing a formal year-long program of courses. Some of the faculty in the program have experience as political aides, although, to my mind, among the full-time staff, there's only one faculty member who's had what I would call substantial senior experience in the political staff. There's more experience among the part-time instructors. The first cohort of students whom I met with just last month is just finishing the program, and I hope they will all find good jobs when they graduate. I applaud Carleton, and actually Preston Manning, who started the idea, for their efforts to create the program. Academic training will certainly help improve the quality of ministerial political staffers. More focused and applied on-the-job training is also being done by the Prime Minister's office. This diverts resources from other government efforts, but to my mind, there is no alternative to investing in more focused workplace training. Some observers have argued that a formal code of conduct is needed for political staffers. There are, as I outlined earlier, several formal constraints on political staffers already. I was involved in drafting some of them. These measures have now been in place for 4 or 5 years, sometimes longer. It is helpful to wonder at this stage if we need more. Now, I would certainly be the first to acknowledge that it can be helpful to draw from prior experience in setting clear expectations for staff. I am a bit worried, though, that an unduly formal code of conduct would detract from the absolute accountability of ministers for their political staff. No matter how carefully you draft a code of conduct, if it implies that bad behavior by political staffers can be defended if it fits within a strict reading of a legalistic text, then a code of conduct is useless. Political aides serve at the will of the minister involved. They have no particular job security, and that is an essential aspect of the job. Any code of conduct, if it were to be useful, would have to be drafted around that central premise. Benoit's study for the Gomery Commission suggests that all political staff be, in effect, certified by means of a short course run by the Treasury Board Secretariat. The idea of a mandatory course for political staff is a helpful one. However, I would submit that if a course is to be effective, it has to be run by other political staff and not by public servants. Forcing a political aide to listen to public servants explaining all the legal powers and securities extended to other public servants might help protect the position of public servants, but any certification course should certainly give political aides a full understanding of the role of public servants. But training for political staff is more likely to sink in if it's largely conducted by current and former political staffers. And since political staffs change with the change of government, there will necessarily be limits to how far a training or codes of conduct of that sort can be institutionalized. The very value of political staffers is that they are not public servants, and institutionalizing their role might help prevent some of the downsides of having political staff, but will also deprive us of some of the advantages of political staff in a democratic system of government. Furthermore, I think that all the training in the world and all the codes of conduct in the world will only go so far in improving the quality of political staff if we can improve the attractiveness of political staff work as a career path. I think we do pretty well at the federal and at the provincial level in recruiting young, capable, energetic, and publicly spirited Canadians to do political work. We also, I think, do a pretty good job of winnowing out the innately talented staffers and quickly promoting them into positions of responsibility. But along the way, we lose too many political aides to other careers. When an aide is fired, there's usually no route back to the career path. The hours are long and the demands are high. There is, I think, a view among political staffers that the longer you stay in Ottawa or in government elsewhere, the harder it will be to make a transition to the private sector career. And moreover, because the job of political aide has no job security of any kind, it is very difficult to recruit mid and late career people from other walks of life to come work in ministers' offices. If mature judgment seems sometimes in short supply amongst ministers' offices staff, these might be some of the reasons why. My biggest challenge as Chief of Staff, my biggest staffing challenge as Chief of Staff, was to find really deeply experienced staff. And I don't mean to say that I would discriminate on the basis of age, of course, but I was always a little more secure walking into a room when I saw some folks with gray hair around the table, or no hair. It's true that the Federal Accountability Act has made this a bit more difficult since lobbying is no longer a potential exit path for political staffers. Most political staff must now wait 5 years after they leave office before they can lobby the federal government. That puts a burden on former staffers, I know. No one, I underline, has foregone more potential income than I have as a result of the 5-year lobby ban. It is, however, in my view, well justified, and I hope the current parliamentary review of the Lobbyist Act will reaffirm it. I do wonder, though, if Canada's corporate sector values the executive-level skills and experience that even very young political staffers get in government. Again, we don't have dependable studies. But I do not recall many political aides leaving ministers' offices for comparable jobs in the private sector. In my experience, political aides have to start again at or very near the bottom of the corporate ladder. People ask me for advice, still on political staff, about how they should prepare for the transition to the private sector. I always told them, take your salary right now as a political aide, multiply by 0.6, and if you're getting that kind of money, you're doing extremely well. Maybe if political staff work were more valued in other sectors of Canadian society, it would also be easier to recruit mid and late career people to political staff work. Now let me return to conclude here to Yes Minister. The show, of course, is great fun to watch. It is superbly written and acted and is slyly instructive. I know of several political scientists who make use of episodes of Yes Minister in their teaching programs. But I do think it's fair to criticize the show for giving the viewer a pretty narrow view of government and of public servants. Rational choice theory is likewise vulnerable to the criticism that people are not all simply narrowly self-interested utility maximizers at all times and in all situations. Public servants are not, in my experience, always venal, status-driven protectors of the status quo. I say that for the benefit of the public servants in the room. Sometimes, but not always. Public servants are, in my experience, often frustrated by bureaucracy and the difficulty of getting things done. They are usually amongst the most demanding taxpayers themselves and hate waste more than any other taxpayer because they have so much first-hand experience seeing it at work. Of course, nuanced satire is a contradiction in terms. Satire works by exaggerating and isolating certain aspects of a situation. Yes Minister is a great show, not because it is a balanced and accurate view, but because it portrays such a partial picture of public policy at work. If we can admit that there's a lot more to public service than Sir Humphrey Appleby, then perhaps we could also admit that Paul Thomas's view of political staff as spear carriers for the Prime Minister or Hitler Youth is only a partial picture. Are there ways we can improve the quality of our corps of political aides? No question. Are some political aides venal, cruel, and maybe too easily tempted? No doubt, just as some public servants are. Government is a human enterprise, and James Madison was undoubtedly correct that if humans were all angels, it would be relatively easy to design a system of government. But political staffers are at their best, as essential to government as public servants are, and when they are at their very best. With Johnson, Shoyama, and Tansley, we are also right to count Coutts, Burney, and Goldenberg amongst important contributors to Canadian public policy. Greg, thank you again for the invitation to deliver the lecture.